Okay, everybody, we resume now where we left off. I was introducing the theme of Chapter 4, which is part of a new section altogether. The section is entitled A Post-Liberal Theology of Jewish Duty. And we spoke a bit about holism. The reason we did is that the chapter that begins the unit, God-Israel-Torah, our holistic context, is such that the notion of the three units taken together, that's why the hyphens are actually quite important, taken as a whole, constitute the context out of which all of his theological reflection proceeds. We left off, although I'm not sure if it was entirely recorded, we left off with a characterization he offers about how Torah is to be understood. I'm going to go back to that just to make sure that it is included in this review material. But I also want to call your attention to a passage which I came across again in the interim between the last presentation I made and this new one. That I think will help explain his overall method even more thoroughly and clearly if I call your attention to it. So first, on the characterization of Torah that he offers, you will find it on page 56 of the text, Borowitz's Renewing the Covenant. Specifically, it's at the end of the penultimate paragraph on page 56, and it says this: broadly, Torah, in quotes, Torah refers to the substance of our ongoing Jewish religious experience. Notice the use of the plural, our. And notice, too, that the Jewish experience that's involved is ongoing. It is actually, I may have left this out, Jewish religious experience. So it is not simply God dictating, whether it is in the form of the actual words that constitute the narratives and the legal corpora of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, or whether it is what Moses writes down after he attains union with the active intellect, a la Maimonides. It is the entire people's religious experience of God, or more accurately, God's presence. God may not be saying things, which generates Torah, which generates, if you would allow, the lessons learned from such an experience, however difficult it might be to describe. And those things written down constitute the teaching that emerges from that joint experience. Now, this is the notion of Torah. Remember also it's ongoing, so it reflects the Reform view of revelation as a continuous process. But it does not make it a continuous process literally every day. It is when certain religious experiences take place. Now, the other thing that I wanted to call to your attention, because it is, I think, truly relevant and helpful, is a statement he makes on page 51, near the end of the chapter, just preceding this one, under the rubric, the particular self that undertakes this effort. If you go to the very last paragraph on the page, which is 3 lines from the bottom, he says the following, and you will clearly see how personalistic, quite literally, his approach is. My theology has evolved primarily from my ongoing personal effort to understand my Judaism. What began as a childhood interest in the ideas behind Jewish living took on an intellectual form at the university and led me to my anomalous concern with Jewish theology at rabbinical school. This interest of mine seemed so odd to most other Jews I knew that I was delighted at 2 discoveries I made there and later. For one, I found a few friends who also wanted to delineate the intellectual system undergirding a richly particular yet universal modern Jewish belief, We were, I can now say, proto-postmodern. That means early or before being postmodern. We instructed each other by argument and proposal, and perhaps more lastingly by calling attention to the contemporary resources each of us discovered that might be of help to us. These were the Covenant theologians that used to meet at Oconomowoc that I mentioned to you. The second happy revelation was that, though no one ever mentioned it in class, there had been a century-long, though limited tradition of modern Jewish theology/philosophy. I found my place in American Jewry as a member of the small sub-community of abstract thinkers still carrying on this activity. I discovered my compelling problem and appropriate method by comparison and contrast with their ideas. In other words, working through his own ideas, he compared whatever he was thinking on at the time with the views of other friends or other sources that he read, and drew comparisons and contrasts for himself, whether these people were present companions or whether they were past figures. And so the last statement in the passage says, "Dialogue with them, as the following pages testify, remains central to my thought." In other words, he is building his theology out of his experience and his reflection, reacting to what he has heard from others or read from others, and then cutting away what he disagrees with. So you will always get, as he talks about various theological topics, a review of the positions of others, and then an itemization of what he agrees with and what he disagrees with, if not in great detail, at least some detail, and then he will draw his conclusions and move on, doing roughly the same thing as he goes through the rest of the book. So he really is at the center of it all, and very self-consciously so. That said, I want to call your attention to a structure that he sets up within Chapter 4 that will be helpful to focus on simply by knowing what's coming in each section. He basically itemizes 4 models for structuring Jewish belief. And I'm going to give you the first 4, all 4 really, but he adds one other. This 5th one will be his own position, and it will reflect the title of the chapter that I just mentioned to you a few moments ago. So what are the 4 models he has in mind for the structure of Jewish belief? And these take up the content of Chapter 4 under the title, the first criterion, the second criterion, 1 through 4, until he gets to the 5th. So first, he lists this: the preeminence of revelation/Torah. And he turns, as those kinds of thinkers who exemplify this position, at least in the contemporary context, Abraham Joshua Heschel and Franz Rosenzweig. And he talks about the views of both of these men. You will certainly recognize parts of what is said regarding Heschel. Rosenzweig you have not had much contact with, but it will be helpful to see his summary there, and also obviously what he agrees with and disagrees with. The second in the system is the rationalistic model. And the rationalistic model he identifies essentially with the thinking of Hermann Cohen, which does not come as a surprise, although you probably want to characterize it a bit more completely as moral rationalism. And then he also considers the views of Leo Baeck, the famous leader of the German Jewish community during the years of the Nazi command of Germany and later Austria, and also for that matter during the years of the Holocaust. Eventually, Baeck was himself arrested, sent to a concentration camp, not a death camp, a concentration camp. And this was Theresienstadt in what was then Czechoslovakia. He managed to survive, and as you may know, he came and taught at HUC. He's the author of a number of important works, the most famous of which is The Essence of Judaism. And you may want to look at that work at some point, either while you are here at the college or in your years in rabbinic life, congregation or not, later on. Now, the third in the system of four is ethnos as preeminent. Ethnos is the Greek term for people, constituting, in effect, an ethnic group. And the person who represents the ethnos as preeminent is Mordechai Kaplan. Why so? Because you'll recall his definition of Judaism, either on the basis of what you have just heard in general through your studies, or any reading you have done on the side. He understands Judaism as an evolving religious civilization. It is the civilization, quite obviously, of the Jews. The Jewish people, therefore, is foundational, absolutely foundational. And the ideas that constitute the religious elements of that civilization are purely the construction and creation of the Jewish people, reflecting on their experience and questions that have arisen for them on religious themes. Okay, their views on God, Torah, Israel, and the rest. Finally, he enters the fourth in the series of structures of Jewish belief, and this is identified as the preeminence of the mediating self. You probably haven't run across the expression the mediating self, at least in your formal readings as yet, but it'll become at least plausibly clear, I hope, that he identifies as its preeminent exponent Martin Buber, and I'll explain why that connection is established with Buber. And he himself can also fit in a broad but somewhat loose sense within this tradition, but he wants to carve out some differences between himself and Martin Buber, and that is why he is going to add a fifth system or a fifth category, and we will characterize that shortly. So what is it that you may recall from Buber that will be helpful here? Remember, he begins his famous work, I and Thou, by saying that the world is twofold, and in accordance with two kinds of relationships that he specifies. One is I-thou, and the other is I-it. And what we took some time discussing in class when we went over Buber, before we began on the work relating to both Fackenheim and Borowitz, was that in this relationship, this unique relationship that we characterize as I-thou, which is very special, which cannot be willed to occur, it either happens or it does not. It involves the whole self in relationship to the self of the other. All of my I will be involved in the relationship to the person who is a thou for me, and the same will apply to you and to anyone else you know that who has this relationship, either with a person or with an animal or with a plant or a tree, with a work of art or a piece of mica, as he famously offers as an example. But the key point here is that the self that constitutes the I of this relationship, I-thou, is not the same self as the one that constitutes the relationship of I-it. In other words, the I is different in each kind of relationship. It's not simply that it's a matter of personal history, but something very different in the nature of who is involved in the relationship comes into play because of the nature of the relationship. That is why he speaks about the mediating self. That self is very important in determining what kind of relationship exists and what kind of outcomes arise from the relationship, in maybe good health in the relationship with a physician who has only a limited amount of time to give to you during an appointment, or even a surgical procedure, but whose knowledge is absolutely indispensable and is very important to you and to me and anyone else who consults a doctor. And obviously the same will apply to anyone else in an I-it relationship. It's not a terrible relationship just because it's I-it. It can be very constructive. It can also be very inhumane under certain circumstances. But it's a different I from that of the I-thou relationship. Which leads us now to what Borowitz wants to introduce as the fifth alternative, the fifth type of system of Jewish belief. And he discusses this after his outline of the other four. And you can find this on pages 70 and 71. It's the key to a fifth model. He calls it the notion of the Jewish self. Okay? This is what he says on page 70, and I'm going to read it through and give some comment to the end. And then we'll take a brief break and resume shortly thereafter. In the middle of page 70, we need a Jewish theology for those believing non-Orthodox Jews who sense their Jewishness is neither incidental nor marginal to their existence, but essential to it. The incredible Jewish saga of recent decades, its Jewish accomplishment as well as its ineffable tragedy, that's obviously a reference to the Holocaust, have made many in our community recognize how primarily Jewish they are. They cannot be satisfied with the common move from universality to particularity, where selfhood comes first and Jewishness second. In other words, I'm a human being, but I care about things Jewish. Thereby dooming Jewish identity to what crumbs of utility it can claim from the table of universal humanhood. I, Eugene Borowitz he means, utilize personalism's extraordinarily resonant term, quotes, the self, unquote, and apply it to these Jews, the ones who have a very central attitude about being Jewish, enabling me to characterize them as having a Jewish self, which is at the center of who they are. As a member of this subcommunity, I seek to give a theological explanation of what it means to be a Jewish self and why I believe this understanding should commend itself to others. Okay? So this now becomes a specification that he wants to introduce into the title of the chapter, God-Israel-Torah, where all three combine together to generate Torah. So he goes on in the last paragraph, and this continues from page 70 on to 71. These considerations bring me to a fifth paradigm, that of the holism, that's H-O-L-I-S-M, of God, comma, Israel, /self. And that means here Israel / Jewish self, even though he didn't supply the word Jewish. Israel represents the community, and Jewish self represents the individual. And then finally, after the comma following self, and Torah. God grounds, or serves as the ground for, the whole, but must be understood, and this is in parenthesis, metaphorically, in correlation of personal relationship, not in some splendid isolation. In other words, God is the foundation, the basis, or the ground for the whole set of interrelationships. But what's unusual here is where he says must be understood metaphorically in the correlation of personal relationship, not in some splendid isolation. In other words, God cannot really stand by himself, itself, if you prefer, herself, in an isolated way. If God's really going to be God, God has to be involved, related in an I-thou relationship too. But it's going to be not only to Israel, the community, which would be the equivalent of God as I, and then we the people Israel, in that relationship with God. But now it's going to involve individual Jews who really care about being Jewish. And that's why they are described in terms of having a Jewish self, that's in the relationship. That's why Israel is followed by a slash and the word self before you can get Torah. Okay? He continues, more specifically, God has an ongoing historic relationship with the Jewish people, one that Jewish practice rehearses and reinstantiates. Don't be put off by the word reinstantiates. What it means is a relationship that is with the Jewish people that is reformulated in specific instances of Jewish practice, sometimes keeping things the same over many, many generations, sometimes introducing novelties, but there is Jewish practice always finding particular instances throughout history because of that ongoing relationship between God and Israel / Jewish selves. Okay? And that's what generates Torah. The nature of peoplehood and Jewish selfhood emerge from this covenantal relationship. So the relationship itself is what the covenant is about. Not the one without the other. We are not talking about separate units. It just doesn't make sense as a covenantal relationship. Against Buber, and here's where he wants to distinguish between where he is and where Buber was. Against Buber, who subordinates peoplehood and Torah to self. In other words, it isn't a Jewish self necessarily. It can be a very secular kind of self that has the I-thou relationship. But whatever comes out of that relationship may yield Torah because of traditional things one has been exposed to from one's education, one's childhood upbringing, which one may or may not have identified with very much. It hasn't been central in one's life, but lo and behold, it may have an impact later. Maybe even the Israelites who had been in Egypt and who had very little of Judaism in their lives, and not much hope either after as many years of slavery as the Tanakh suggests, maybe they also had very little of a Jewish self at the time. But it was possible for something to arise from the I-thou relationship. And Buber traces this in a number of his essays, and famously in his book, Moses, which is his treatment in a theological and quasi-philosophical way of the stories related to Moses and the book of Exodus and what follows throughout the end of the last 4 books of the Torah. So he goes on from here. This relationship that he's been speaking about, it knows its most personal singularity stems largely from its people's corporate closeness to God. In other words, the relationship that Borowitz is trying to advocate and build his theology on is really predicated on a corporate Jewish identity. And you'll remember his references earlier to the corporate covenant, that's the covenant with the whole people Israel, and individual self-determination. And that will have to be discussed as we go. And that's, by the way, what's connected with the self, the individual Jewish self. So it knows its most personal singularity stems largely from its people's corporate closeness to God, and therefore that its very selfhood, the Jewish self's very selfhood, is substantially constituted by its participation in the covenant. So the individual is really going to be involved in that covenantal relationship between God and Israel too. The Torah the Torah that results from this God-Israel/self relationship is more individualistic and pluralistic than orthodoxy can tolerate. In other words, this is not simply the 5 books of Moses, presumably. This is the unique individual interpretations that individual Jewish selves have from this exposure to, confrontation with, relationship with God and the people of Israel, that will yield something that will be of some significance, indeed maybe even decisive significance, for instructing Jews and living Jewish lives from that time forward. So that's why he speaks of it as more individualistic and pluralistic than orthodoxy can tolerate. But he goes on and adds, and also more pluralistic, more particularistic than rationalists will find responsible. Why? Because it's about the people Israel, and it's about the individual Jewish selves, and it's not simply moral teachings for all of humanity. It really pertains to the people concerned. God treated as a personality, the eternal thou, who cannot become an it, the people Israel, the individual Jewish self, and then of course the Torah results from it. And then he adds, more theocentric than humanists can allow. So you can't, if you're a humanist, admit God into this equation, but for Borowitz you most certainly not only can, you must. And then finally he adds, more ethnic than personalists find congenial. Personalists like Buber, for example, who are interested in personal relations of I-thou, without characterizing them necessarily in connection with being Jewish. One can have an I-thou relationship perfectly well without being Jewish. But he would like that Jewish element. He, Borowitz, would like that Jewish element incorporated quite centrally. And so he goes on to say from here, let me now explain what that means. And the rest of the book develops this in considerable detail. This unit that I've just been discussing with you is really quite central. If you understand this, you will understand a great deal of what takes place later, even if some details obviously may not be so easily penetrated, because the basic structure is right there in what I have just reviewed with you. That said, we'll continue on shortly with the next unit. Now, in continuing on this topic, let me just offer a few critical observations that might be a bit helpful in reflecting on the fifth model, the notion of the Jewish self, and what is entailed by this. That is of some interest, I hope, as we reflect on what Borowitz is trying to accomplish. First, let me simply call your attention to the statement regarding the fifth paradigm and the introduction of the Israel/self. When he says God grounds the whole, but must be understood metaphorically, and I would highlight metaphorically, in the correlation of personal relationship, not in splendid isolation. What does this mean? Basically, what I'd like to suggest is that it's absolutely essential that God grounds the whole. However, he is prepared to hedge his bets somewhat by introducing the expression metaphorically. He clearly means that personal relationship is real, and it's also knowable in human terms of personal relationships. Friendship, parent-child relationship, things of this sort. But it seems that Borowitz hedges somewhat. By backing away from Buber, we become both individual Jews and a Jewish people in the covenant relationship. There is no independent personal relationship with God, apparently, apart from the Jewish self. In that sense, it's restrictive, and insofar as he introduces that adverb metaphorically, he's basically either saying, I'm not entirely sure that this is literally the case, or we can only speak in very general, qualified terms. So he wants to differentiate himself from Buber, and he does do so, but Buber allows for secular Jews, as well as non-Jews, to have I-thou relationships, not only with other creatures, human and non-human, but with God, the eternal thou which cannot become an it. In the presentation thus far, as Borowitz has outlined it, and as I understand him, the Jewish self, at least for Jews, is what is crucial, and a role for secular Jews doesn't quite figure into it. So that is both a narrowing of the range of possible I-thou relationships. I think that seems obvious. And the hedging of his bets would be a certain kind of humility by introducing the expression metaphorically that one really cannot say with literal certainty or literal clarity exactly how the divine-human relationship is to be expressed. That's one critical observation. A second is to be noted in this. He requires that God be the ground of our values. Another way of expressing this is that God is the foundation of our values. Most religious Jews, and even many who would not necessarily be very religious, might find this acceptable. But what's interesting is that postmodernists generally, there are always exceptions, postmodernists generally are anti-foundationalists. They are not looking for grounds that will certify and give a solid foundation that should not be easily challenged or maybe even challengeable at all, that will be the basis of whatever positions they want to outline. They are prepared to say, this is my perspective on things, this is how I see them, and there is no need for foundations. The experience alone is sufficient to give justification for the perception, for the articulation of the perception, and the perspectives that go with it. So this is a second thing that is at least unusual if Borowitz wishes to present himself as a typically, characteristically, postmodern figure. Third and finally, it is interesting that his conception of my morality is largely tied to the thinking of Immanuel Kant in terms of imperatives that will be evident to one's reasoning mind, that are applicable to all, and should factor in the application of the rule without exceptions, except where it does not apply, period. And yet, Kant is characteristically a spokesman for a modern point of view, a modernist point of view. He flourished, after all, in the end of the 18th century, in the beginning of the 19th century. Not long, but long enough. And his influence was felt throughout the 19th century, especially at the beginning, and especially at the end, through the work of Hermann Cohen, among others. So that Kant should be invoked for a postmodern is a bit unusual. We turn now to the character of God as he is portrayed. And the language that is used is a bit unusual. It is largely associated with philosophical terminology, but I do wish to call your attention to it because it's quite interesting. And it is essentially this. God is absolutely necessary for his theology to work. That should not be in doubt at all. But he goes on to characterize something about God as not absolutely absolute. And it's not God's role in setting up the theology. It is God's role vis-a-vis Israel / the self and the imperatives that arise from it. For example, we have a definition of what is meant by the absolute in a number of places. I'm going to call your attention especially to page 72 and 73. The very beginning on page 72, he says the following. The genius of religious modernism lay in disclosing humankind's creative role in shaping religion, the very insight that has now led to its deprecation for letting humanism replace reverence for God. However, in the struggle between modernism and religion, behavior, not theology, has been the critical battleground. I think the orthodoxies are generally correct. Again, you see his sympathy for traditionalism and even certain forms of orthodox traditionalism. I think the orthodoxies are generally correct in their criticism that liberalistic humanism too easily led on to permissiveness and thence, that means from there, to license. In other words, breaking rules with abandon. With personal freedom enshrined in this way, but the older rationalistic ethics no longer compelling, liberal religion appears to abet, that means aid and give support to, moral relativism. When does a liberal committed to tolerance and understanding ever say no? So that's the problem that is created by this following of liberalism. And he answers here, my answer begins with an exploration of one extreme of this issue, just how absolute an absolute is the God of the covenant. Generally, the view has been, at least in the Jewish tradition, God gives the commandments, and human beings, God's creatures, or those God has redeemed from servitude and slavery in Egypt, who owe God, are obliged to perform what has been commanded. And at least in certain passages, in Exodus especially, this is expressed in a very forthcoming way. All that the Lord has commanded, we will do and we will hearken, okay, or listen to. However, he goes on page 73, and suggests the following, namely, that obviously this absolute, in its most primary manifestation, is relational. In other words, God has relations to other creatures besides God, human beings, some of whom are very receptive to what God says, some of whom are far less receptive to what God says, and some who are in outright rebellion against what God presumably says. So, he goes on, God creates a fully real, independent world and makes covenants with people free to accept or reject God's will, including a special covenant with a single people, linking God's own historic destiny to that of the Jews. You may remember the famous rabbinic midrash on the statement, I believe it's in, I think this is from Isaiah, but I'll have to check. Atem edai nu'um Adonai. You are my witnesses, saith the Lord. And the rabbinic drash on it is this. If you are my witnesses, I am the Lord. But if you are not my witnesses, I am not the Lord. Which is to say, that God cannot be God without the relationship and the affirmation that is provided by human beings, especially the people of Israel, in support of and in adherence to what God requires, commands, and expects. Okay? This is what follows from what's involved now. The God of the Hebrews, I'm still on page 73, paragraph 2. The God of the Hebrews, then, can only be termed an absolute, an oxymoron, begging for explanation. He puts quotation marks around the word "and," suggesting that in addition to God as the absolute, God is only one absolute among others that exist. So what is he referring to? He continues, to the extent that biblical and rabbinic Judaism know, meaning are aware of, no reality or rule equal to, much less greater than, that of God, we may call God their absolute. Yet, and what comes after the yet is quite important, yet this cannot be meant in its philosophic sense, that God is the absolute, or their absolute. This cannot be meant in its philosophic sense, namely a thoroughly self-contained, aloof, immovable reality. I would put it somewhat differently as an utterly independent reality. The most common Jewish practice relating to God nicely captures the ambivalence. We know God's personal four-letter name, but we may never say it, keeping our proper distance by using only the euphemism Adonai. As it were, this is in effect kivyachol, the special Jewish sense of God's absoluteness requires us to say that Judaism knows of an absolute only in a weak, not a strong sense of that term. So however powerful and authoritative and special, holy if you prefer, God may be in an absolute sense, that absoluteness is qualified because the efficacy of God's words and even of God's acts are in some ways contingent on the cooperation, interest, adherence, fidelity of Jews and even other human beings. Balaam, for example, who follows through and says what he's supposed to say, finally, after attempting to give curses, for example. So in that sense, strong absolute refers to God in the usual senses, utterly independent, can't be contested, can't be challenged, can't be ignored. When God speaks, that's it. Everything must follow in accordance with what is spoken. That's the strong absolute. What Borowitz calls the weak absolute is a God who can be interacted with, argued with, even challenged in certain respects. Think of Genesis 18 and Abraham and the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and the like. And yet who will respond in certain ways, qualify, even relent on plans that he independently arrives at. Think of Moses' specific pleas with God after the golden calf incident, whereby there's eventually assurance that the people will continue to exist and will make their way successfully through the Sinai wilderness, eventually to reach the promised land. So that is the key element of what is involved here. You might also say that this is characterized in rabbinic literature too. You know the famous Agadah about God giving only kalalim, that is to say general principles, general norms in divine revelation. But the paratim are for the Israelites, for the sages, and all of their Talmidei Chachamim to give in each generation as required. So once again, the absoluteness of what God has to say is qualified because the specifics have to be filled in, which make God a weaker absolute than an unqualified absolute would normally be. This leads us to the issue of the distinction between God's imminence and transcendence, and we'll turn to that momentarily. Turning now to the issue of divine imminence and transcendence, what we find is that Borowitz is not satisfied with a purely immanent point of view. Imminence that is pure, as far as he is concerned, destroys distinctions of worth. One loses the moral yardstick, and for that reason one needs transcendence to balance imminence. In other words, if God is not high or higher than we are, if God is not in a position to instruct, to guide, to command, to see more broadly than we can see, or at least know more than we can know, then the reasons for looking to God for anything diminish. In fact, we may not even find a single source of authority that is ultimate in any meaningful sense. That is why he calls for divine transcendence as an important characteristic or quality of God. Sometimes, however, and he has seen this also in philosophical and other theological literature, the word transcendence with a capital T will be used as a virtual substitute for the word God. Similarly, you could have on the part of, let's say, humanists or atheists, or if you prefer Spinozists, pantheists, for example, the notion of imminence with a capital I, in which whatever is of value, whatever is instructive, whatever should be our source of guidance about living life and attaining what is worthwhile, is to be found in this world and nowhere else. In that sense, you can say there are aspects of human experience that could be characterized as divine, but divine only in an adjectival sense. There is no separate God above and beyond to stand as a model vis-a-vis whatever the universe or the world we live in represents. So he does want to give a special emphasis to the importance of divine imminence, and to note that God stands as a transcendent figure vis-a-vis the world we live in, and without this role played by God, we may simply idolize, or if you prefer, deify our own concerns, which may vary in all kinds of ways. It can be matters of ethnicity, that is to say the group we belong to is the source of all that is sacred and valuable and what we must follow and be loyal to, which is indeed a kind of idolatry. Aestheticism, our sense of what is beautiful and attractive and exciting, all aspects in one way or another of aestheticism can likewise be raised to the level of divinity, but falsely from his point of view. Another example of a false absolute would be religious behaviorism. In other words, the law has been given, and it is for human beings, particularly the great scholars, halachic men, for example, to determine what the law is and requires. And we don't need God, not really, to tell us what needs to be done, to exemplify what the ideal is, to interact with answers to questions, perhaps to be a presence, but a very silent one at most. God may be lonely, but he's going to stay lonely, because it is for the sages to determine these matters, and all that really counts is one's knowledge of halacha and one's adherence to halacha. That is religious behaviorism. It may be a somewhat caricatured version of Soloveitchik's view, but nonetheless it is akin to what Soloveitchik stands for, at least in public recognition of him. Other examples of these kinds of idolatrous absolutes, false absolutes, would be human altruism. Humanity will do the right thing, and we will put our trust in humanity at its best. It will eventually, express itself and all will be well. Social action can become such an absolute. Introspection can be an absolute. I commune with my own soul, and that will bring out all authenticity and all worthwhile guidance, and nothing else is needed. Meditation and all kinds of exercises associated with meditation. Higher consciousness that can come by the time we set aside for meditation. That can be another false consciousness that he refers to. And he also mentions mysticism, although he is quick to say that he does not have personal experience of the mystical notions of union with the divine, or the sense of the oneness of all reality as an expression of divinity. This is all taken up in the chapter 6, called More Than Imminent. And the parts that deal with behaviorism start on 86 under the rubric Religiosity as Aesthetics or Behavior Patterns. Then you have mysticism dealt with on 89 and the following pages through 91. And the other foci that he takes up you can examine on your own. He even has some serious criticism of Buber in the unit entitled Piety, Good Relationships. No, is piety good relationships or deep self-knowledge? That is to say, that's a question. Is piety good relationships or deep self-knowledge? I will let you read these items on your own and indicate that what we will turn to next is the whole question of reaching for transcendence, moving back from a functional God. He has in mind Harold Schulweiss's view of divine predicates, in other words, the qualities and attributes of God. They represent what is truly divine. And the notion that they are somehow assembled in a unique way in the personality of God is far less important than the notions of justice, mercy, love, and other such qualities that represent what is truly divine in his view. He wishes to bring us back, essentially, to the notion that God, as a personality, enters into relationships with Israel, instructs Israel, and in working together with Israelites, that is to say, individuals as well as the people as a whole, Torah will result, which is the characteristic feature of Borowicz's stance. I think I'm going to leave it at this point for this particular unit. We will continue with Borowicz and the next, the next disc, and we'll be dealing in part with questions of personal God, and then on his notion of Israel, and a little more on Torah born of the covenant and what that entails. You'll specifically want to read with some care the closing chapter of the book. Its title is, let's see here, it's The Jewish Self, I believe. One moment. Yes, The Jewish Self, which begins on 284 and goes through 299, followed by the afterword. So it is not particularly long. With that, we will close on this particular unit. It will be the equivalent of one session, a little bit of the second, and we will continue in the next session to make up all that is remaining for the unit on Eugene Borowicz for Philosophy 402. I thank you for your patience, and I hope likewise for your interest, and we will come together soon.